We'll go to the entry sheet and we've got this data running down here. And what we want to do with this vertical data is turn it horizontal. So it needs to come into this data set, but we've got to choose the very last cell every single day of the week. So it needs to be moving. So when we run it the first time, it'll be row 19, but the next time it'll be row 20. And I might sort of produce a macro that works in this situation, and then we'll assign it to a button. So we'll add that to this particular sheet, and then we can press the button each time that we want to run the macro. Alright, so let's record another macro. We'll record a macro from the Developer tab and this button. As a macro name, we'll type add to DB. Add to database. As a description, we'll say this will add the template to the database sheet. And we'll click OK. Now, we might want to isolate this range so that it says the range is from C2 to C10 is selected, and now we want to copy that data. So Control+C. Then we go into the database sheet and let's click into cell A2. It doesn't matter where you click in column A, but it just probably more towards the top. It's better. And now press Control at the down arrow. That takes us to the very bottom arrow at the very bottom, the very last line. Now let's use the relative reference. So we'll click this relative to this cell. This is one cell down. So we've clicked the relative reference, we go one cell down, and we'll unclick relative reference because we no longer need it. Now all we have to do is incorporate the data that we copied from the entry sheet. So we right-click and we paste special. Then we choose values in number formats. Values in number formats, and then we want to transpose the data. So we want to turn it on its head, basically. So it's the transpose and the values and numbers formats. We click OK, and then the data is pushed into row 19. Now what we want to do is go back into the entry sheet. Isolate the cells from C2 to C10 and choose Delete. So we've cleared the form. Then we might want to click on, say, cell C1. Alright, so that's what we really need to do. I'll stop recording the macro. Let's go and have a look at what the code's telling us to do. So we'll press Alt F11. Get used to running those shortcut keys. Excel doesn't always perform consistently. Indeed, when it comes to recording macro. Sometimes it drops the macro underneath the previous macro, and sometimes it just creates a brand new module. So let's just tidy the macro up. Add to the database macro. That's kind of obvious. This will add the template into the database sheet. Okay, that's very good. That's effectively what's actually happening, and it assumes that we're starting off in the template sheet. So we're starting in the entry sheet, and then we're copying the data. It's reasonably easy to use. We're selecting the database sheet, and we're selecting cell A2. And then we're going to the bottom of that range. That's selection dot end Excel down. And then from there, we click the relative reference button. And it says relative to the cell that we're in, we're offsetting one row down. And then it's selecting that cell. And it's not selecting A1 because this is the relative reference. It's just saying that it's selecting the cell that's actually in and giving it a relative reference of A1. So it may be A19, but that's just the way the coding works. And then this is where we paste special. This is the code that goes in with it. Paste special values and number formats. And then it should say transpose equals true. And all the other stuff is really irrelevant. So if we were tech savvy, we would get rid of all the stuff that wasn't relevant. So it's only those two pieces that are really relevant. But you can leave it if you wish. It doesn't really matter. So you can choose to do whatever you like. But that's what I want. I want comma transpose equals to true. Now we go back into the entry sheet. Then we clear the contents of selection C2 to C10. And finally, we select C1, all right? So that's effectively what's happening. It's not very difficult to read what's actually happening in a recorded macro because the words that are being used are the same words that you use to describe anything that you do inside of Excel. Ranges get selected and values and number formats are exactly the same. The word transpose is the same. It's not really hard to cover what's actually happening. Sheets entry, and then there are Sheets database. So it's working quite nicely. Now let's go and test the macro. So I'll press out Alt F11 and I'll go back into the sheet. I'll copy this sort of dummy data that we've got over here and just paste the values. I'll change this number, so maybe it's $10,000. Workers, it might be 2. I might change the job from 1021, so I've got sort of a different bit of information. Alright, I'll leave the remaining fields the same, so we've got slightly different information. Now, I said I'd show you how you could actually add this code to a button. If we want to add it to a button, we just go Insert from the Developer tab. And then this item here is a button, so we can choose Button. And then I'll drop a little button just there. The next step is to assign the button to a specific macro, and I will select Add to Database. Then click OK. Now we might want to give it a name. We might just call this Add. There we go. Now the macro is assigned to this button, and then we can choose to click this button and the database will be populated with the new data. Before clicking the button, I'll move the database worksheet and isolate row 19 in a different color, so we can see the data coming underneath that. Let's go back to the entry sheet, and now I'll press the Add button. So we click Add, and there's a slight screen flicker. We go into the database sheet, and there's new data. Just here, there are 10,000 that we included, slightly different job number. So it looks like it works quite nicely. So that's our recorded macro, and we've been able to do that without a great deal of knowledge about how to trap the last range in a particular spreadsheet, the last use range. We've just used the record macro function and the relative macro function to pick out the last sheet and the last cell, and it will select the last cell every single time we use it. Good job. So that's how you do a couple of those things.